So, a very Dutch introduction to standards, cows and milk. But standards is a very complex network. You've got the International Standards Organization, which most people have probably heard of. Probably most people here have heard of the British Standards Organization. You have two international, the ISO and the IEC organizations. You have CEN and CENELEC. And then as the Dutch standards body is a member of those, BSI is also a member of those, at least they're still a member of CEN CENELEC. It's wait and see if they can remain a member of CEN CENELEC, but that's a separate discussion. And then, so basically every country has a standards body, apart from America that has a whole load of standards bodies, of course. And the standards are not written by standards bodies, they're written by the experts in industry who come together in technical committees. And essentially what the standards bodies do is they assist the drawing up of agreements, a process of consensus to actually reach the standards. So it's a very complex world, it's a very political world. Stakeholders have to be brought together in order to reach that consensus process. And from that, a standard is then produced. So within most standards bodies, they're divided at least into two. Some also have certification bodies, as BSI does. Most don't. So most consist of standards development process and publishing. And I've been at NEN now for 23 years. And when I arrived at NEN, standards development was the central activity of the organization, which is understandable. It's the content on which everything happens. And publishing at that stage was just part of the overhead of the organization. At a certain stage, at the beginning of 2000, a publishing business unit was set up. And essentially then you saw that things started to change because within the technical committees, you obviously have the experts who reach that consensus process to actually draw up the final standard. And then you have the end user, the person who has to actually implement that standard. Now, you would assume that the expert and the end user would, in essence, be the same people because the stakeholders from industry are the people who write the standards. So you would assume that they would write the standards with the end user in mind. In practice, that is not the case. In practice, the experts are completely focused on achieving consensus and as much as possible, obviously, ensuring that the needs of their particular company are incorporated within that standard, which in the end is drawn up. If you think of the Philips and the Shells of this world, they participate very heavily in the standards process. So what the end user at the end has to do with that standard has never really been in focus. And publishing within standards bodies was simply we received the PDFs, a closed document, of which we were not allowed to do anything. We simply created basically the platforms in order to make those standards available. Underneath, I've given you a bit of a timeline for NEN. The majority of standards bodies exist now for 100 years or more. So we were set up in 1916, and you can see along the timeline the development of PDF, then we did POD. In 2007, we set up our first platform named Connect for 24/7 worldwide access to standards, all in PDF at that stage. And then in 2011, you got the beginning of the move to XML, which was initiated by ISO in the beginning. But you can see that an increasing number of standards bodies, particularly I would have to say in the Western countries, in Europe, America and so on, are moving to XML and got more and more of the content available in XML. We obviously also, as a member of ISO, IEC and CEN CENELEC, have also all the international European standards. So there's an increasing amount of content available in XML. Our system then Connect is now also XML ready, so we can show the standards that we now have in XML in HTML. It's a very uneven process. It's been a very difficult process, as much as anything else because partially because of the split between ISO and IEC. So as a national standards body, our customer wants all the standards they want. They're not particularly interested whether it's an ISO, an IEC, a Senelec, an ASTM, an API standard. They just want all the standards, preferably in the same format, and they don't understand why the standards world is not capable of doing that. There are moves in that direction now. There have been some big steps forward. But this is, in essence, the timeline until 2016, 17. We began to think about, well, ConTech, our platform now has existed for almost 10 years. At some stage, we would need to think about whether we'd need to start from scratch, build a new platform, because you continually to build on the ideas that you had almost 10 years ago. So we started to think about that, and we had discussions with 67 Bricks. We'd done a lot of stuff previously with 67 Bricks, and our experience was that certainly in helping us to think about what we needed to do and helping us to conceptualize those ideas and then turn them into concrete ideas, they've been extremely helpful. So we had some discussions, and essentially the idea that came out was, okay, if you build a new platform, rather than it being document-centric, you make it content-centric. And what does that mean in practice? So at the moment, if somebody searches in our ConTech system, they get a list of documents. And I can assure you that some companies have to use hundreds of documents. And the average standard can be anything from 10 to 200, 300, 400 pages. So the person who has to implement those standards has firstly to gather all the standards together that they need, and then to go through all those standards to find the content that they need. So the idea was, given the fact that we've now got XML, could we actually do something else to help the user to dig down into that content and to find the information that they need? That was also linked to... these things never work for me. I'm probably pressing the wrong button. Hmm? Does it work now? Oh. I'll keep talking. Okay.
It's frozen.
Part of the recognition that we needed to do something was also based on a report that came out by Outcell. I don't know how many of you know Outcell, but every year they produce a report on the standards industry. And essentially what they were saying to us was the world is changing fundamentally. Industry is digitalizing, and the content as you produce it now basically is not keeping pace. Unless you do something as a standards world to improve how you offer that content to industry, then you'll be bypassed as time goes on. Which is also partially linked to the fact that within industry itself, what we're seeing is all the old experts involved in standards development are gradually, as with people like myself, are moving towards retirement, and they're being replaced by a whole new layer of people who don't have the same background and expertise necessarily and haven't been involved in growing up those standards. So what do we need to, in order, is it going to work? Yeah. Outcell. So the biggest disruptor of the standards market, as elsewhere, is seismic digital transformation and the vital retooling needed to address changing end user needs driven by the speed of technological change. And that, again, has been a kind of a wake-up call for a lot of the standards bodies. So, as I was saying, we started to discuss with 67 Bricks and internally at NEN, well, okay, if we take a content-centric approach, what can we do to assist the end user to both find and to use our content? And on the basis of that, essentially what we did, we worked out, we talked to our customers a lot. We have an awful lot of contact with our end users, so we have a good idea on a certain level of what they need, and also we're able to play the ideas back to them. But essentially what we did, we gave 67 bricks all the XML that we had. We worked out some very basic ideas, and then we just basically said to them, get on with it. Show us what you can do, which they did, because that's what they like to do. And this is what I've tried to do here is just kind of gather various things together. So they built a prototype for us. And what we're talking about is with the XML, it means that you can begin to identify what's in that content. So first of all, the term cloud means that it's become a lot easier for the user to dig down into the content on the basis of initial search that they would do with terms, so they can continue to dig down into that content and find what they're looking for. Essentially, it begins with the fact that rather than finding a list of documents, you get pieces of content back. Pieces of content based on the search that you've done, which should be relevant to what you're actually looking for. And as I say, with the term cloud, you can then dig deeper down into that content. What we've also done is we've made it possible to search on type of content. So standards contain an enormous number of tables, an enormous number of formulas, and the feedback that we got immediately from one of the users that looked at it was it was absolutely brilliant, because he knows which standards he needs, and he knows the table, but he doesn't know where it is. So now he can just do a search within the system and say, just give me the tables back in that standard, and then he can very quickly find what he's looking for. Related standards. If you think within our ConTech system, we have 162,000 standards. And there are massive links between the standards. They're referenced both initially in the standard, but also throughout the content. So what we've attempted to do is simply to visualize that information and give the user the possibility to see what the network is of standards which may be relevant to the particular area that they're working in. Definitions. Definitions is an extremely important part of standards. Every single standard begins with a list of definitions. The problem is that standards are written by technical committees, and different technical committees come up with different definitions, or slightly different definitions. So this gives the possibility to the user, and actually also to the technical committees, to be able to pick out very easily all the definitions according to the terms that they've searched for, which actually in the long term hopefully will also give the possibility to begin to align those definitions rather than them being slightly different, which can be very confusing. Related sections. I heard somebody, I think yesterday, talking about semantic fingerprint. The idea here is that on the basis of the piece of content that the user has selected, that the system, by analysing the rest of the content and creating a semantic fingerprint of that piece of content, will then be able to say, well, I think that these pieces of content are probably about the same subject that you're looking for as well. So with the related sections, and what we also did, because what we know at the moment in industry is what they do is they copy paste from standards, and it takes them a lot of time. They take the information they need, they integrate into their own company documents or for a specific project. So what we've done is we've made it possible for them to create their own custom standard, again by taking the pieces of relevant content, putting them together, and then adding their own information into that document so they can create their own custom standard. So this is basically the first round of our prototype, which we put out to a number of our users, asked them, you know, is this the way you want us to go? Is this useful? And the answer we got back was yes. There was one issue on that, and that was the issue of context. So what they said to us, yes, we want to be able to do this, but we need always to be able to link back to the context where that piece of content came from. So that's been built into the system, so you can always see the link back to the context. And the other issue, which is essential for the users of standards, is that they always know whether or not they've got the most current version of that particular standard. So they need always to be able to link back and to know whether or not the piece of content that they're using at that particular moment is correct. And one of the other things we developed previously with 67 bricks was a redlining tool, which is a massive time saver for our users. I went to one of the water companies one time and they showed me what they had to do when a new version of a standard came out, because they have to go through all the standards and link them to their procedures. And in kind of massive Excel lists, they then have to explain when they don't adhere to the standard why they don't. So if a new version of a standard comes out, they then have to go through that standard, see exactly where it's changed, and then go through the procedures and see to what degree that influences their procedures. And with the PDFs, you know, it's literally a question of going through every part of the document. With a redlining tool, which we made together with 67 bricks, we made it possible for them immediately to see in detail exactly what's changed between the two versions of the standard, which again was a massive time-saving device. I think essentially what we've discovered as we've had more and more contact with the end users of standards was the enormous amount of work that they are entailed in order to use our content. Okay, so why this? Well, essentially what we discovered when we put the prototype out there and talked to users was that they actually didn't expect us to do any of this stuff. You know, standards bodies are very conservative, and the users of standards are very patient, and they didn't really think that we'd get much further than PDF. So they'd kind of got used to that, and they had their people who did their stuff, and I talked to a few of the experts in companies who literally were making Excel lists for the other users within the company to say, if this is what you're doing, you need this standard, if this is what you're doing, you need that standard. And, you know, they thought, well, NameConnect, I think it's a great system. We get really good customer feedback on NameConnect. And they thought that was it. So what happened when we showed them the prototype was that they started telling us what they really needed from us, as opposed to what we thought they needed from us, which is partially what's in the prototype, but more very, very specifically, what they need to be able to do with our content is to extract the requirements from standards. At the moment, I talked to a guy from Shell who's been working quite a lot with us recently, and he said one of the problems with the technical committees, you get all these experts together and they want to do a brain dump. All their knowledge they want in the standard, regardless of whether it's particularly relevant to everybody. So this is why you get these massive documents. But what a company needs, for instance, in the construction industry or in the oil and gas industry, they need to be able to extract the specific requirements from the standard and to use that to link them to the specifications that they're working with, to link them to, if necessary, to the legislation, and put all that content together. So this was the kind of feedback that we were getting. Standards bodies should provide requirements in data format rather than PDFs and PROs. Updates and revisions should be traceable to a specific requirement. If the requirements can be captured from the standards directly to the requirements database, this would save thousands of man-hours of work globally. I went to a civil engineering company and I asked one of the guys who worked there, well, what do you actually do with these requirements? And he just made this drawing for me and explained in detail. I didn't have time, unfortunately, today to show you because it's brilliant. It shows you exactly the process through which they have to go with big structural projects and how they have, in every single phase of that project, to be able to show that they've adhered to the standards, that they can verify the work that they've done. So they need the specific requirements within that process. So what we've done, both at NEN but also with some of our European colleagues, is we've designed what we've called the short game and the long game. And the short game is, to what degree is it possible to identify and extract requirements from existing standards? As I say, we've got a hell of a lot of standards within NameConnect. In the ISO directives about writing standards, they talk about what the shall, should, may, and can. Every standard should be written according to these 4 words to identify whether it's a requirement, recommendation, permission or possibility. Fact of the matter is, it's not the case. The fact of the matter is that standards are written as prose, and it's almost as if somebody who's writing the standards think, well, we'll keep it interesting, so we'll keep using different language. So it's actually, although standards are probably more structured than a lot of content, they're structured in terms of creating a document. So what do? We, together again with 67 Bricks, we looked at how we could use natural language processing and first of all, natural language processing to see how far we could get in identifying the requirements. So this is basically what we came up with. So we've attempted by creating rules both in Dutch and English to see how far we can get in actually identifying the specific requirements within a standard. And we've highlighted them according to what we've called the level of requirement. And you can then also extract that information and put it into your own custom standard. So this is what it looks like if you look at the actual information from the natural language processing. By the way, if you've got any technical questions on this, Sam or Jennifer will answer. By the way. We then did some work with machine learning where the idea was basically that we would get users to look at what had been identified and they can correct it. And on the basis of correcting the information, the machine will begin to learn. Now, one of the big challenges that we have, and I get very jealous when I listen to people from Elsevier and so on, is we don't have the domain specialists. Yes, we have them in the technical committees. We don't have them at NEN. We don't have the expertise to be able to go through all this content and to check whether or not what's been done is correct. So that creates a massive challenge for us, which is why we've now decided to put the prototype out there as a beta version linked to our NEN Connect system and ask users to look at it and give us feedback on that. And I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to get to the well, basically what we learned from doing this work was how badly standards are written. And it's not that the technical content is bad, but it's the way that the technical content has then been written. As I say, it's written as prose, it's inconsistently written, it doesn't adhere entirely to the rules, it's very often ambiguous and open to interpretation, which obviously is not what you want with standards, and definitely not if you want them to be machine readable. And they contain multiple references to other standards, which involves the user going from one standard to another, trying to find the complete content that they need. So, as I said before, we also defined the long game, and the long game is that standards need to be written differently. As I said here, if you look at the developments within the industry, large numbers of companies are now using requirement management systems where they need to bring all that information together and feed it through the system. You've got developments of things like the building information model, augmented reality and so on, which are being used more and more by industry. Industry is way ahead of us in terms of their use of technology. And what we need to achieve is that standards need to continue to be human readable, but at the same time they need to be machine readable, machine interpretable, and they also need to be interoperable with other types of content. So all that content could be mixed up together. So that's the challenge we face. We have projects now started, both particularly in the European sphere, also in America they've started projects to see how we need to redefine how standards are written. And just in conclusion, the problem is embedded in the complexity of the standards development and consensus process, which also means that that has very much been in the way of progress in the last, I would say, 100 years in terms of doing things differently. And what we're now finding is that the pressures for change is coming from the end users who are basically saying to us, your content is no longer fit for purpose if we want to use it in the modern technology that we need to be able to work with today. So as publishers of content, we have a massive catch-up to do. And I would say that if you talk in terms of standards of the future, it will mean that standards and what a standard is will fundamentally change in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you.
Done.